Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a newcomer into the temple, coming to us from Raven God Games, the creator of the Sword and Sorcery role-playing game REAVER, which we'll be getting into tonight. The one and only Joseph Salvador. How you doing today, man?
I am doing great, Mildred. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for coming on and braving scheduled hell, because we had set this up a week or so ago. Then things ended up happening. Then we had to play DM tag with each other.
It is what it is, man. Like real life happens, you know. So
yeah, I always plan for the off chance that something like this might not work out, because as I learned working in insurance, nobody is a perfect planner, and anyone who says is a liar. And you can plan all you want, but sometimes shit happens.
That's a fact.
Now, with that in mind, I do have to go into a bit of a tradition of mine, and that is the humble beginnings, or the origin story, or the villain origin story, depending on whether or not you're a GM or a player, because every GM has a little bit of villain in them.
Sure.
So, walk me through your first introduction to role-playing games and what made it stick.
Okay, so I started role-playing with the Menser Red Box back in like 1986 or 1987. A friend of mine at school, I would have been in middle school at the time. he introduced me to the Dragonlance novels, actually, and I read those first, and then he was like, well, I have this other thing, and it was D&D. I was like, oh, let's check this out. So, my imagination was immediately sparked. I've always kind of been like a creative, just with art and that sort of thing. So we played. I loved it. I got into another group. We started playing, like AD&D, like 1E and 2E. Variety of like Palladium games back in the 80s and 90s. And I've basically been gaming since then. Maybe a few lulls, I guess, while I was in college. But yeah, I mean, what made it stick? I would just say the imagination involved in it and the creativity. It's kind of my creative outlet. I can't really do those things at like my real life job, so it's something that I feel like I need. And I guess whenever there's been a few games that kind of inspired me to like actually write and publish, and really they were Swords and Wizardry, specifically the white box version, and then also Astonishing Swordsman and Sorcerers of Hyperborea.
Yeah,
and
it's funny, both of those have gotten featured on this channel in some form.
Oh, that's awesome! Yeah, that's awesome. Like I wrote something intending to put it like out like an article sort of fashion or something like that for Hyperborea, and I sent it to Jeff Tolanian, who's the creator there, and that's when he asked me to write an adventure to go with it, and that eventually became Forgotten Fane of the Coiled Goddess, which is a Hyperborea adventure. And after that, I started just self-publishing with my game Eldritch Tales, which is a white box game. I've kind of been doing that since 2015, 2016. So.
Yeah. Now, obviously, REAVER is in the realm of sword and sorcery, and while a lot of people, when they hear sword and sorcery, they're going to think of Conan, but what would be some of the, aside from the really obvious entries, what would be some of the less obvious entries that served as inspiration for the creation of REAVER?
That's an interesting question. I'm all over the board with inspiration. REAVER specifically is meant to kind of replicate that flavor of sword and sorcery that is just like a sidestep from historical fiction, like historical action adventures. So there's as much of Robert E. Howard in REAVER as there is like Cornwell and like The Last Kingdom. But sword and sorcery specifically, I think of the works of Paul Anderson with, he's probably best known for The Broken Sword, which is kind of right in my wheelhouse. But he also did a variety of like historical Viking adventure tales, which are like just awesome. We have the works of David C. Smith, which is the Tales of Etluma, I think is what it's called. He wrote a book. What is the name of it now? It's going to escape me. He wrote a book relatively recently, within the past maybe 5 years. Once Lofty Towers, and that is it's an incredible book. It's like sword and sorcery literature to me. Definitely an inspiration to me, and also Richard Tierney's works, specifically his Simon Magus series, which is kind of blends like sword and sorcery, the Roman Empire, and the Lovecraft mythos all into like this one sort of like crazy thing. All of those things are inspirational to me, and might be visible in REAVER.
Yeah, and the big reason I often get into those kind of things is everybody's gonna be bringing up like Fritz Lieber or Robert E. Howard or sometimes Michael Moorcock if they're feeling daring enough. So, and in the temple we tried not to go for the easy stuff, But
oh, sure, yeah.
now, was it with going further with the origin of REAVER? Was it a case of you just house ruling stuff while doing things with Hyperborea or Swords and Wizardry that just became its own thing, or was there a more distinct origin point?
Actually, you're kind of spot on. Originally, REAVER was a white box game, and I guess I should say that this has been in development for at least 4 years now. I really started while we were in COVID lockdown, so it's been a minute. At that point, I really just wanted to create sort of like a very familiar game, white boxy, light rules that you could just jump into. And the more I worked on it, the more I changed. I believe it was 2022 at Origins in Columbus. I had some really successful playtests with several different groups, and while the games went really well and everybody seemed to have fun, I found out that they were having trouble at grokking the game, and that's because I used the D20, the typical D20 mechanic for like things like combat, but then I used like my attribute feat system, which is the die chain mechanic, for some other things, and it was just kind of confusing. And one of my players, and I've said this elsewhere, I wish I could remember his name. He said, "Don't be afraid to be unique," and I thought about that, and I really took it to heart. And at that point, I scrapped so much of the D&D isms in it. Like even then, it had like advantage and disadvantage and things like that. Scrapped all that and just went with the die chain mechanic, which we can talk about. So
yeah, let's get into that, since that's so much of a core thing that you put it at the top of the Kickstarter. So
yes,
how did this concept of the die chain, of using different die sizes, even if a few had to be made up, kind of, how did that come to be?
So obviously, REAVER isn't the only die chain game. Like Dungeon Crawl Classics uses the die chain.
Yeah, there's been stuff like the usage die in the Black Hack, and of course, when it comes to multiple die sizes, a lot of people are going to think of Savage Worlds.
And that's another story. And yeah, I've been told that the game has some similarities to Savage World, and I didn't know that until one of my players told me and kind of introduced me to Savage Worlds.
Yeah, from what I've seen, as far as any similarity to Savage Worlds, I don't really see it.
I think it's just the base. So in REAVER, you want to hit a 4 or better on any die. It's almost always a success, unless it's an opposed feat. And if I recall correctly, in Savage Worlds, you need 6s or higher, something like that.
It is 4s, but each multiple of 4 is a raise. Basically,
okay.
If you get just a 4 or maybe a 4 and some change, that's considered barely a success. In order to have more degrees of success, you need more 4s.
Okay, I see. Yeah. Like I said, I haven't played it. Yeah. So where were we going with that? The die chain mechanic. So yeah, I don't know when I first thought that I wanted to use that. I know that it had something like I made up attribute feats, the term at least, in Eldritch Tales, in which in that game it was just a D6 roll. But then the more I thought about that, the system kind of grew out of that, just as I considered how I could use that. And those early sort of evolution, I don't really, it's kind of hazy, honestly. I can't really say, oh, this is what made me think of it. But eventually we decided that I wanted to use the die chain. I wanted to use all the dice. And for a long time, I just used the basic dice, D4, D20. Mostly because I don't like making people buy extra stuff. Like, I don't want people to have to buy extra dice to play the game. However, in order to make the game work a little bit better, to have more range variations in the success rate, we eventually decided that it was time to introduce the extra dice. So we added the D5, the D14, and the D16.
Yeah.
All of those can be replicated with the normal dice, right? So you don't actually have to buy dice. Everybody wants to buy new dice, I know, but it's not necessary.
You know? Yeah.
So,
if finding a gamer who has enough dice is I'll believe that around the same time that I find a truthful lawyer.
Right. Doesn't exist.
So
so basically the dice chain mechanic is, in a nutshell, most things in the game operate on the die chain. As your roll gets modifiers, the die goes up and down following the die chain. A D4 becomes a D5, a D8 becomes a D10, etc. Or it goes down in the same manner. So with the target of 4, the higher your die is, the higher your chance of success.
Yeah. And with the so it's going to be a case of aim high, and you're trying to shoot for, with certain exceptions, a 4 or higher. That's correct. Is there anything special that happens if you roll the highest or lowest possible on a given die?
So we're going to get into something extra here, but if you roll a 10 or higher on any die, it's considered a critical success.
Yeah.
Some of those you can only hit with a D20, right? If you roll a 1, you can't choose to make it a critical failure and something bad happens to you, in which case you will get 1 point of resolve, which is our narrative currency for the players.
The extra effort mechanic, as I've called these kind of things.
Okay, yeah. Exactly.
Which, given some of the expenditures for resolve, is certainly on point. And speaking of resolve, one of the things I did want to ask is it, because with the more common expenditures that were on that cheat sheet, each of them only cost 1 resolve. Is that going to be a general rule that if you're spending resolve, you are only spending 1 per whatever you're using it for?
So that, I believe that is now the case. It wasn't always the case. There are some spells. Some of the spells in the game will have specific resolve uses. So you might be able to spend a resolve to maybe affect more people or something like that. In the game, a while ago, like 2 or 3 versions ago, I guess, there was a lot more resolve going around. And some of those expenditures required more. I can't think off the top of my head of any that are more than 2. There might be a few that are still require 2 resolve. That's a good question, because there's just so many spells I don't really remember, and I've gone through so many versions, I sometimes forget things. But yeah, overall, most resolve expenditures are 1. All player characters start with 2 resolve at the start of every session, and they would reset to 2 resolve after a rest if they're lower. Only rogues get more resolve, and they can let other characters borrow their resolve, kind of like the halfling in DCC. And you can get more resolve through gameplay. So,
and speaking of that, now this wasn't delved too much in the quick start, but I do find it interesting that you went with a class system. There's a fair few sword and sorcery games that aren't using D&D-isms that that go for a little more freeform, but you went with classes.
Yes.
And not only that, with levels. So I suppose one of the first things I'll ask on that, and this is where I'll get into a bit of character creation.
Sure.
Starting with attributes, is it a case where your choice of origin is going to determine your starting spread of attribute dice, or is that chosen via random? Is that chosen by point buy? How does that work?
So, okay, so you mentioned origins. So origins actually don't have any mechanical benefit at this time. They are there for kind of flavor, and also to they kind of inform the player on their character's sort of cultural background, maybe the gods they worship, and things like that. So no, that's not related to attributes at all. Mm-hmm. I definitely wanted to get away from like that kind of like old school mentality of these kind of people are stronger than these other kind of people. I don't like that. Attributes. The base rule is to roll 3d6, add it up, check a chart, and when you look at the chart, so basically if you roll like I think it's 8 to 12, that's basically average, and that attribute would have a d6 die. If you roll higher, you could have a d8 or a d10 for your attribute. There are two options in the book. One is to roll 46 and drop the lowest. The other is a stat array. Kind of just depends on how the GM and the players want to kind of tailor their game, really. Mm-hmm. So like I mentioned, like all of the attributes, brawn, agility, stamina, cunning, intuition, and presence are replicated by a die. They are assigned a die. Mm-hmm. It's not like you have a score and a die or anything like that.
All right. So with that in mind, the next part that I wanted to get into is feat proficiency. Is it a case where at character creation you're picking two attributes that you have feat proficiency with, or are they chosen based on your choice of class?
The class affects that. So your class assigns one, and then you can choose another one, anyone you want, basically. All so right. There is definitely some character, choices to be made there. Yeah. And as far as like classes go, like I mentioned earlier, I did want to create something that was familiar. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I feel like there's enough games that do sword and sorcery with a classless system. I didn't want to try to like rebuild Barbarians of Lemuria or Conan. You know what I mean? I like the class system simply because it's familiar to me. It's easy to jump into, and to me, so a character in Reaver they have a number of sort of like core concepts. One is their attributes, another is their origin, mm-hmm. Which is their culture and background. Another is their class, which describes their core role in the game. And then finally, they have careers, which they get 3 careers over the course of their leveling. They start with 1, and their careers are sort of like their work background, so to speak. They could be a pirate, or they could be an outlaw, or they could be a thief. They might be a commander, whatever. Each of the careers grant a feature, either a narrative type feature. Off the top of my head, there's the Wanderer, which allows you to, whenever you enter a new sort of area, a new town or a new country, you can roll a die, you can roll a feat of presence, and if you succeed it, you know somebody there, you have a contact in that area, right? So it's just a narrative thing. Mm-hmm. Other ones are mechanical, might give you a new resolve expenditure that you could do, or some sort of bonus or modifier. Yeah. There is no skill system, so the careers kind of indicate to the player like what they would be good at. And the player has to be their own advocate during gameplay to say, hey, I have to climb this rope, and since I was a freebooter, I can probably climb ropes really good because there's ropes all over ships, right? Oh, yeah. In which case they would get a modifier.
Yeah, you gotta swing around ropes if you're gonna be doing that swash and buckle.
That's right. That's right.
But
I think I went away from your question, actually.
No, it got to where I wanted to. The other thing I was curious about is especially given the way a lot of classes work with having gradual modifiers. You know, the whole balancing across a campaign of several levels.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a feeling that when it comes to leveling up in terms of your class, the stuff that you get per level is going to be things like new tricks, or in some cases messing around with attributes. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, so you do get attribute increases as you level. It's every other level. Like I mentioned earlier, you do get 3 careers as you level.
Mm-hmm.
And then the classes themselves, they're front loaded. So they're almost like AD&D classes in that manner. It's like you get all these abilities up front, and then your attack die, your melee die, and your range die, and your defense die go up. For spellcasters, they also have a sorcery die, which is made for the roll to cast system. Some character abilities, class abilities, I should say, do change as they level, so they would get more powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, I can certainly get that, and I'm guessing that within, since you brought up AD&D classes, is there the possibility of kits when it comes to those classes, or is that something that would be more handled in the career end of things?
So yeah, like you're talking about like second edition kits, character kits.
Yeah.
Yeah. In REAVER, I would say that would be actually pretty similar, probably, to the careers. I didn't really think about it like that, but I think the character kits from back then were more, maybe a bit more powerful. Like you got more abilities and extra weapons and things like that, if I recall.
They were all over the place, honestly.
Yeah, I don't think it was balanced at all.
It wasn't.
No. Yeah, but yeah, to answer your question, that would be most similar to the careers, where you get your variety of careers. So a good example would be like Conan. Now, depending on the story you pick, Conan is a multitude of things, right?
Oh yeah.
But he's always a barbarian. That would be his class. He's always a Cimmerian, which is his origin. And then he might be a thief. His careers, he might be a thief, a freebooter, and a nomad. Or he might be a scout, a thief, and a soldier, right? Being a game, I had to limit the number of careers you could have. Conan's the exceptional, example. But that is kind of like the goal of the system I've built, is to be able to allow the player to create a character who has a core role, but they can modify sort of like their more broad skill set, right?
Mm-hmm. Now, with that in mind, it sounds like the class would be a foundation, and careers would be a means of personalization.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it. Mm-hmm.
Now, that leads me to shift into the big old elephant in the room that has decided to crash on my couch, and that is in regard to magic. Since even as much as I enjoy stuff like swords and wizardry to a point, or a lot of the retro clones, there is one old habit that a lot of them fall into, and that is having big ass spell lists.
Yeah. Do you have a spell list?
Yeah. Now, obviously, there's going to be a spell list here, but I have a feeling that you don't want the ridiculously long spell list that some games had back in the day, where I mean back in AD&D, you had a whole letter-based series of books as if it was the Encyclopedia Britannica of spells.
Yeah, exactly. I remember those books.
Mm-hmm.
No, you're correct. Like I mentioned earlier, REAVER grew out of a white box game, and I'll admit that there's some spells in here remaining that are clearly inspired by D&D spells, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've altered the way. Well, one, it's a roll to cast system, so it operates completely differently.
Yeah, I
from your
noticed that you have
fantasy and magic.
you have a sorcery die, and you're using it the same way for feat rolls as you would any of the other attributes.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So,
And I could get into that, but before that, to talk about the spell list, most spells have like a primary spell, and then they'll have like alternate castings. So if you only learn one spell at first level, but it's actually usually like 3 spells. Okay, that sounds confusing, but basically you can the alternate castings are related to the primary spell in some way. And just I will give an example here, I guess. And so like Curse of Enfeeblement, which is basically Ray of Enfeeblement, right? This is a scholar level spell. I only have 3 levels of spells. It's Initiate, Scholar level, and Master level spells.
Yeah.
So you'll be able to get this. Most characters will be able to get this around 5th level. And they get Enervation as an alternate casting, which is related to the Curse of Enfeeblement. And they also get Rot, which is related to that. They can cast any one of those. So it's just it's almost like a block of spells that you can choose from. And that keeps the spell list a little bit shorter to look at, but allows the spell itself to be more open-ended. Like you have more options with it. I guess another example would be Induce Sleep, which is basically a sleep spell. But then the alternate castings are Dream Message, so you can enter the Dreamlands and talk to somebody who's also sleeping, or like a Nightmare Curse, which would affect somebody for several nights, basically. Yeah, so it's a little bit different to wrap your head around. Once you kind of read it and play it a little bit, it's pretty straightforward.
I'd say in that regard, the spell use that I'm seeing based on the way you describe it has more in common with stuff like, say, the Age system or Barbarians of Lemuria, or any manner of sword and sorcery games that have a much more horizontal spell design instead of a vertical spell design. And this is definitely this does not meet the 3 factors I have for the Vancian model, which I consider a benefit, because even when I was playing AD&D, I was never a fan of it. But the 3 factors that I've always brought up are Fire and Forget, i.e. the spell can't be modified or in any way. A fireball spell is always going to throw a fireball, no exceptions.
Right.
Because of the variants that you already have that taken care of. The preparation parts, from what I'm seeing and what you've described this as, there's no preparing your spells and then having to do an 8-hour rest to get them back.
No, that's correct. Preparing, so all the spellcasting classes have sort of like a requirement, like a daily requirement to either pray or like study their book or whatever. But they don't have to like say, I'm going to learn this spell and learn this spell and this spell.
Yeah.
There's none of that. So long as they hit the requirement, they can cast any spell they know.
Yeah.
The sorcery die itself regulates how many spells they can cast in a day, because if they attempt a sorcery feat, which is what we call it in the game, 4 or higher is a success, the spell goes off. If it's a 3 or less, it's a failure, and your die degrades for the day. So your D8 becomes a D6.
Excuse me.
Oh, bless you.
Thank you.
So your D8 would become a D6, and then you fail another one, it would become a D5. So it becomes more difficult to cast spells and more dangerous. If you roll a 1 on a sorcery feat, it's a miscast. And something bad could happen to you or the people around you or somewhere else in the world. Off the top of my head, there's one that, like, I think it's a summoning spell. If you miscast, one of the options on the short miscast table for the spell is like the next creature born within a mile becomes a monster permanently, right? So that's something that affects gameplay later, right? Like that's creating a narrative through the dice, right? Again, I went off on a little bit of a tangent.
And as I recall, there are ways to utilize resolve to boost the spell if you so wish.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You might extend the range. You might affect more people. You might cause more damage. All those things are possible. And like we said before, like the game has a resolve table of like standard expenditures. They are not limited to that. If a player wants to try something else, it's up to the GM, the chronicler is what we call it in the game. The chronicler can say, "Yeah, throw me a resolve," and that can totally happen. I had a player. We were kind of like in a tense situation in the game, and he wanted to know if maybe he knew somebody in the crowd. So yeah, spend a resolve. You know this guy. That kind of thing. That's not going to be on the chart, but GMs and players free to make things up.
Yeah, and with each of the spells, there's a attribute that's referred to as its focus.
That's correct.
When it comes to that attribute, is that meant to be? How is that meant to be utilized in relation? Is it a case of the strength of the effect?
Yes. So so every spell has a focus attribute. This is something I also used in Eldritch Tales, slightly differently. But it's meant to tie, so every spell is kind of like tied to a certain style of casting, right? So a charm, like a charm type spell, is related to your presence die, okay? Because that's your force of character and whatnot. The way your attribute affects the sorcery feat is that if you have a exceptional, in this case, an exceptional presence, a D8 or higher, you will get a modifier, a positive modifier to your sorcery feat. So your die would go up, right? So if you had a D10 presence, that would give you a +2D to your sorcery die, increasing your die by 2 steps.
Yeah. And obviously with a lot of the effects, there's a reference to like CD3 or D5 or D6. What would the C be in that case?
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned the black hack earlier. The CD6 is my version of the usage die. It's the control die. I actually renamed it after the OGL debacle.
Yeah, and a lot of things got shuffled after that. I was at ground zero for the whole thing.
Yeah, we all were. But in Reaver, it actually does a lot more than just sort of like equipment or like expendable materials. In Reaver, the control die might control things like creation, or it might control things like ongoing damage. So you might have like CD8 ongoing fire damage because you're on fire. So every round you have to roll a D8 and hope that you roll a 1, 2, or 3 so it degrades, right? Over time. So it just has it's a bit more of a broad use in Reaver.
Yeah, I can certainly get that. Now, with that in mind, when you're dealing with magic in Sword and Sorcery, you are usually dealing with messing around with phenomenal cosmic power, and even beyond miscasts that can still screw over a mage if he's not careful. And I believe you have that answered in Corruption. That's correct.
And Corruption didn't show up in the quick start just because it's a bit more involved. I'll just say spellcasting is the crunchiest bit in the game. It's the most rules heavy part of the game. m- mostly because I wanted to make our spellcasting suit the genre, right? I don't Vancian magic to me doesn't feel sword and sorcery. It feels Vancian, right? It feels high fantasy.
I'm not even sure if it feels. I'm not even sure if that model feels Vancian.
Yeah.
Especially since the Dying Earth game that Pelgrane made all those years ago didn't even use it.
Was that right? I didn't know that. That's funny. That's funny. No, so I wanted sorcery has to be powerful in sword and sorcery, but it also has to be dangerous. It has to have risk involved, and in sword and sorcery, the wizards are usually the bad guys, and that's because following the path that they follow with magic is corrupting in some manner. I don't necessarily want the game to be physically corrupting, so that our player characters become tentacle monsters or whatever. But in REAVER, it's handled with shadow and corruption. So some spells are labeled black magic spells. Anytime you cast that spell, you have to resist shadow. Shadow is connected with your presence die. I don't want to get too deep into the rules of it, but it's connected to your presence die. If you fail to resist shadow, you gain a shadow. The more shadow you have, the more it affects you. When you rest, for every 3 shadow you have, you gain a corruption, and then your shadow goes away. You have a maximum corruption, also based on your presence die. If you exceed that maximum corruption, you become an NPC. That's where those evil wizards come from.
Yeah.
So, like I said, it's kind of like the deeper end of the rules. But corruption can affect you. It can affect you physically, so you might get like some sort of like strange effect. Maybe you get snake eyes or something, or cat eyes or whatever. It might affect your attributes. It might affect the way you cast spells. Like some spells might become easier, like black magic spells. You might actually get better at casting. It's like the dark side, right? Or it might just affect your personality. You might become exceedingly greedy. So it's just like a role-playing sort of thing. There's like a big chart on all the different corruption effects. But we found that that's a pretty in-genre way of handling it, and making I had a player who I dearly love. He said that he felt like I was trying to make it hard or dissuade players from playing sorcerers. And I was like, I don't want to dissuade. I want people to play casters. I just want them to work for it. Right?
Or just reinforce that when you're playing a caster, you are playing with fire.
Exactly. And I'll admit, I don't know that it's going to be for everybody. I think it's cool. I'd play any one of these casters. But it is hard. I think it will be hard for some players to really, get into it, because you kind of have to manage a lot of stuff. You have to manage your corruption. You have to manage your shadow.
There's been a lot of games over the decades that have, I would say, overly favored casters, both as either whether it be as a system mastery archetype, or just giving them all of the damn options so that everyone else feels like a one-trick pony. And of course, anytime this gets brought up, I hear a bunch of caster mains act like this is not a problem at all, or the game isn't meant to be balanced, which is real convenient when it's balanced in your favor. I had mentioned before the spell encyclopedia, when you consider how many books, regardless of edition, were just dedicated to adding more spells. That whole things aren't meant to be balanced feels like cope.
Yeah,
I'm
how many new weapons did the fighter get?
Yeah. I mean, or
Yeah.
just the fact that when Tome of Battle came out, you had a bunch of the casting favorite players screeching about how this was fighters stepping on the toes of casters, which I find completely hilarious, given how there are certain caster builds that are entire parties by themselves looking at you, cleric.
Sure. Right. Yeah.
Or the fact that I'm not sure if you know about this, but the reason prestige classes weren't in the 3rd edition player's handbook is because they ran out of room.
Oh, is that right? No, I did not know that.
Yeah, I contend that they would have had room if they didn't have a bunch of useless duplicate spells that just added bloat. Like, did we really need 18,000 versions of protection from?
Yeah.
And that's just one example. The point is that when it comes to the whole, you're just discouraging casters, I look at that as more of a consequence of how coddled casters have been in innumerable amount of fantasy games. Not just ones in the old school or new school debacle. This is something that goes beyond that. This is a problem. I'd say genre wide, because of the fact that the problem wasn't addressed early on, and then tradition set in, so the problem never got addressed. Like the
sure,
like the
even in early editions. Yeah, absolutely. In early editions, yes, spellcasters, especially like mages or wizards, were really weak, levels 1 through 4. But as soon as they hit 5, they win. Right, they're winning the game. Right.
Yeah,
basically
they are playing. That's why you have the trope linear warriors, quadratic wizards.
Yes. Right.
And I have a feeling that one of your goals is to make sure that everybody's setup is somewhat useful, somewhat contributory. Is that even a word? To the narrative from the word go. Like, you're not a one-trick pony even at first level.
Right, absolutely. All the classes, even, I have like 3 fighting classes. Well, I guess maybe 5 fighting classes, but like the Barbarian is different than the Berserker, is different than the Fighter. The Scout is different than the Rogue. They each kind of have like a core role that they do, and really, so the 3 main warrior types, the Barbarian is really good at like crowd control, especially at higher levels. But they're also like wilderness warrior type guy, and they can like shake off sorcery and things like that. The Berserker is all about his fury. So this is more like Logan Ninefingers rage than like D&D rage. He kind of becomes uncontrollable. So if the Berserker is maybe like he's berserking a little bit too long and the fight's over, he has to try to stop it. And if he doesn't stop it, if he fails to stop it, he just attacks whoever's nearby.
I suppose I could make an analogy to Hulk whenever he gets going.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, they can take it to people. And then the Fighter is more like technique. Technically savvy in his fighting style.
Yeah. Somebody who had some sort of proper training.
Right. He's really good at using his armor. Like he can. Well, I guess that's another point. The armor doesn't do anything for like your keeping you from being hit. There's no AC in the game.
Would armor affect soak?
It's damage reduction. Exactly, it's damage reduction. And it's just a straight value that you take off of any damage you suffer. The Fighter improves that. If anytime they're wearing armor, it's improved. So that's another thing they do. The Rogue is kind of roguey, honestly. So if you're familiar with thieves and rogues from D&D, it's pretty familiar. And then Scout is kind of the ranger. Obviously no magic or wolven pains.
I'm actually glad for that, because this is something I've had some back and forth with some of my colleagues and some of my friends over the years. I fit ranger as a class has been cursed from day one.
Yeah, I agree entirely.
I don't know. Even the AD&D, some people look at the various retoolings of the Ranger in like 5e and think it's cursed. I'm like, no, this thing has been cursed since AD&D. Because you had the fact that it was a fighter who couldn't use heavy armor, and because of the way AC worked, he was very squishy, which is why Ranger down became a running joke. And while I don't have any proof of it, I suspect that the amount of times Rangers got downed or killed is the reason why some sort of at death's door death save rules started to crop up in games.
Maybe, yeah.
I can't say if that's actually what happened, but that's a feeling I get because of that. Then of course, second edition wasn't much help. There were some kits that were slightly better, but it was still but there was still the question of why should I pick this when I can pick a druid and do all of that and then some, which is a recurring problem.
Or play a fighter and be a better archer.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's
the problem with a lot of those in-between classes. They didn't really have a whole lot to go with. The Bard would have had that same problem if there wasn't the pivot towards the Diplomancer concept. Then third edition came along, and you get Favorite Enemy, which is only marginally better at attacking. Then fourth edition comes along, actually does a decent job, but everyone tells me I'm supposed to hate fourth edition, but I don't because they're not signing my checks.
Yeah.
And
hey man, I played it.
And then 5e comes along and back to square one, and they've had to try and fix that 3 times in the last 5 or so years. And the only decent fix was from Larian of all people. I think that speaks volumes. But point is, it's been cursed from day one, and it's largely been due to 2 things. One, kind of hard to do an outdoorsy character in a game called Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
This is the reason the Cavalier didn't last.
Yeah.
The other problem is it was a case of anything that it could do, other classes were better at it, and it didn't have anything to balance that out.
Exactly.
And I've often told people the approach we need to take with the Ranger, or in this case the Scout, is not to think of Legolas, but to think of Rambo.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, or any kind of just like Forrester or like Robin Hood or whatever.
Robin Hood still had some casting, so I'm not willing to count him.
Okay. I never really got the spellcasting aspect of the Ranger. I was never into that. I just wanted to play like a mountain man. You know what I mean?
I'm pretty sure most people who pick Ranger want to be the outdoorsy type. The casting part is not the focus.
Right. I dig the animal companion stuff. I think that's cool. Scout doesn't get that in Reaver, but it is possible. There's a Beastmaster career that you can get. But yeah, I agree. Like I just feel like the Ranger, the old school Ranger, was just trying to do too much, and it suffered for it. And I really wanted to love it back in the day.
Pretty much. But the bigger thing, and I'd say the approach that you're going with the Scout is more of that outdoorsy, live off the land approach.
Yeah, they're very much like a skirmisher, woodsman, like a tracker, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's, and I should note when I say to think Rambo, I'm specifically referring to Rambo in First Blood.
Sure.
Not Part 2 or Rambo 3 or anything like that.
Yeah.
Because in those situations you've got somebody who isn't exactly fighting fair, who's using his environment as his weapon of choice.
Right. And
as I understand it, when it comes to things like priest and sorcerer, there are variants depending on what paths you wanted to take.
Yeah. So so we just take like the priest for example. the priest has like a core set of abilities, but you choose a faith, like a priestly faith is what I call in the game, and those are druidism, shamanism, and theism. Druidism is not your typical D&D druid. It's more like a Celtic druid. They're seers. They are cultural diplomats. And while their spell list does have like some nature-oriented spells in it, they also have like charms and like divination and like speak with dead and things like that. The shaman is very much like a tribal priest who interacts with the spirit world and the dream world, and their spells kind of reflect that. They can create like amulets for themselves and for their allies. That's kind of like a downtime sort of activity. And then the theist priest is basically, it's more like a typical cleric where they're dedicated to a specific deity. They come from like an organized temple, and their spell list is kind of it's kind of like a dilettante sort of spell list, but they also get extra spells from their primary deity. So yeah, that's kind of like it in a nutshell. Sorcerers follow kind of like a similar pattern.
Yeah, I can certainly get that. Now, with that in mind, what would you be shooting for as far as a page count? I know the quick start is pretty beefy for a quick start, but what are you shooting for the full book? Like 250, 200 pages?
It's going to be roughly 350 pages. This is like a complete game. Like, so you have all the player facing stuff, all of the adversaries, all the GM facing stuff, plus things like mass combat, naval warfare, sea travel, exploration, all the spell list. And then also, it's also going to have a short setting at the end of the book for GMs that want to use it.
Yeah.
The rules themselves are not directly tied to the setting, aside from the origins. And the setting is very ancient world. It's very recognizable as like being inspired by our own Earth history. It's all intentional. I wanted the origins to reflect obvious cultural types without being like stepping on into like the cultural what's it called? Borrowing cultural aspects and being disrespectful with it, basically. I have done quite a bit of research on a variety of things. Now, most of the cultures and peoples that I've been inspired by are like, they're gone. Vikings and ancient Gaels and things like that, Roman Empire. But I do have like inspiration taken from like medieval West African empires. So I want to be careful with that, especially when it comes to like religion. Some of like the religions that were worshipped, the native religions that were worshipped in the Middle Ages, were directly analogous to what's being worshipped in West Africa now, like their traditional religion. So I don't want to step on those toes or anything like that. So while my origins are recognizable as real-world historical peoples, they're not meant to be those peoples. They've been kind of fancied up, so to speak. But the reason for that is that I want people to be able to look at the book and say, oh, Kemites, those are Egyptians. I can use them for and this other game that I want to play, or this other setting I want to use. Totally works.
Yeah, I can certainly get that. I will definitely be keeping an eye out on how REAVER develops. But with that said, I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my temple and enjoy the madness that happens around here.
It was a great time, man. I really appreciate you having me on, and we'll do it again sometime.
And anytime you see fit to return, whether it's more of REAVER or just to shitpost about really weird fantasy exploitation movies or something like that. The
Okay,
door is
yeah.
always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged. And, of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there will be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here, on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra, I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody!
Thank you.